So I feel slightly ill at ease talking to people who are in cultural policy, because it's not something that I've ever really directed my thinking towards. I'm very much an archaeologist who has got dragged into cultural heritage by the sites that I've been excavating. So I'm going to be talking today about some of the lessons that I feel I learned on the way as I got dragged into the whole issue of cultural heritage management and policy making. Çatalhöyük, I just want to briefly say something about the history of the work there. Çatalhöyük was first excavated in the 1960s by James Mellart, and he found some of these very iconic findings, and then he ran into a series of difficult scandals that led to his no longer being able to excavate or work in Turkey, and so the site was abandoned from 1965 onwards. When we started in 1993, this is what the site looked like. There was a lot of erosion and collapse of walls and buildings. Lots of paintings and sculptures were just falling off the walls and lying in a great heap at the bottom of the sections that he had left. So it was really in a terrible mess. And even though the site was well known internationally, there was nothing there to visit, and there were few to no visitors. So when we started work in 1993, one of the main tasks that was set us by the Ministry of Culture and Tourism was to create some sort of infrastructure and to create a heritage site that could indeed be visited and could attract tourism. So one of the things that we did was to build a dig house and visitor centre that you can see here, which has a space for about 100 researchers to live there, and 12 laboratories for different specialities, so people can work in an integrated way at the site. And over the two main excavation areas, we constructed shelters. This is the north shelter, and having the shelters allowed people to visit through the year. You can see the visitors coming into that shelter. So the site became accessible through the year, and this greatly increased the number of visitors, tourists over the years. And you can see again here the south shelter, where people are working and preserving the site for visitors. So in doing this, I was increasingly aware of the need to develop some sort of policy, some sort of management plan, and a series of institutions really forced that on us in any case, not only the ministry here, but also the European Union, from whom we got funds, and UNESCO, and I'll come back to UNESCO later on. But all of these required us to produce management plans and to come up with some sort of policy. And so it's within that framework that I'm going to be talking. And for me, I guess the main policy aim was to somehow contribute to the local community, to somehow engage the local community in Çatalhöyük in such a way that benefited them. And so training local people near Konya, on the Anatolian plateau, training local people, bringing them to the site, educating them, involving them in our conservation and so on work, that was all very much part of it. And over the years, that remained a main focus. But it became clear that was not a simple aim, that the policy aim of trying to support and assist local communities was very much at odds with many of the intentions and policies of the other people who might be around the heritage table. So if you imagine a heritage table at Çatalhöyük, these were all the people that we dealt with. Of course, I never managed to get everybody to sit around a table, so this is just a sort of conceptual device that shows you some of the people that we were mainly dealing with. But so the local communities here on the left are what my focus was, but it was a matter of how to relate that to these other groups. And I'm going to be talking particularly about the archaeologists, the government, UNESCO, tourists, and the media. So I guess the sort of challenge is it possible to support local communities in terms of heritage, given these other conflicting interests? So as I said, one of the other stakeholders around the heritage table is the archaeologists. And here you can see the archaeological team at the beginning and in the middle and at the end of the 25-year project. And the most obvious thing is the increase in numbers. And so that immediately has some impact on the local community. And in the top, probably about half of those people are people from the local community. Whereas down in the bottom, the local community is swamped by the very large numbers of people, 160, 150 people every year, coming from all over the globe with their very different specialities. And during the 25 years of the project, the techniques that we used changed quite dramatically. So when we started in the 90s, people were still doing what we see at the top, sort of using paper and plans and pencils and pens in order to record what we were finding and to make drawings and so on of what we were finding. By the time we finished at the end of the period, so this is in 2016, 17, 18, everything had gone digital. So there was no more paper. It was all paperless, and everything was recorded digitally. You can see someone using a tablet here, and one of the effects of this is that the amount of knowledge that you needed in order to excavate at Çatalhöyük increased exponentially. So that in order to use those tablets, you needed to be able to use ArcGIS and various types of database software. And it took a lot of training and was very difficult. It was a wonderful technique, and the archaeology was a lot better, but it was much more specialized and difficult. And so one of the effects of this is it became more or less impossible for the local community to be involved in what we were doing. The level of education that you needed was the university level or higher in order to get into these systems. And so just this process creates a conflict. We're trying to involve the local community, we're trying to engage them in what we do, but the methods that we're using are becoming so complex and difficult that the local community is excluded from engagement. And one way of showing that is the work that was done by Alison Mickle. So what she's doing here is using network software in order to show the linkages between the members of the archaeological team. She's looking at how members of the team reference each other in their recording sheets when they say, I learned this from somebody, or someone else says this, and I read this and that. so they're referring to each other, yeah, in all the recording that we're doing. And when someone refers to someone else, Alison Mickle draws a line, if you like, between those two people. And what you see is that there are two clouds. That the main cloud is at the top, and that is the main team, the sort of foreigner team, whereas the local community are completely separated off in their connections with each other, in what they write and do, in the pictures that they appear together in, and so on. Any connection that can be made, you see that it's really quite separate. And this is something that didn't exist at the beginning. It's something that developed through time at the end. So you can see here how we're struggling to find a way of integrating the community into the research process. So the attempt to engage the local community is frustrated by the way the archaeologists are continually working. So there's a conflict that's emerging around the heritage table. One of the other stakeholders is of course the Ministry of Culture and Tourism and the Turkish state generally. And the importance of Çatalhöyük, one example of the importance of Çatalhöyük to the state is at the World Expo in Shanghai in 2010. The Turkish pavilion was copied off one of these paintings from Çatalhöyük. And what we're listing here is some of the many ways in which increasingly over time the ministry controlled what we were doing and managed in a very detailed way the way that the archaeological work was done. And this is normal. This is the way that one finds in most nation states. And one of the very positive things that the ministry did was to promote Çatalhöyük onto the UNESCO World Heritage List. And this was achieved in 2012. And you might have thought that this process of going onto the UNESCO list would be an important way in which the community would have a voice. And this is because the UNESCO process itself mandates that there is dialogue and discussion with all the stakeholder groups, and including the local community. So there is a mandatory process of engaging all the different stakeholders, including the local community. And so that did happen. But there have been several papers written about this, and someone did a PhD at Stanford on this process. And in actuality, the whole process of negotiating and engaging with the community was entirely for show. There was no real engagement. The meetings that were supposed to take place didn't take place, or the local community voices were not listened to. The muhtar from the village was not involved properly. And in fact, the local community felt excluded by the whole process. And so this should have been a way in which things were brought together. But in practice, the local community again felt excluded by the way the system actually worked. The engagement was a formality and did not involve really any substantive taking into account the views of the local community. Nevertheless, the engagement with the ministry and their promotion onto the World Heritage List all helped to increase the visibility of Çatalhöyük in terms of the media and the public. And certainly it helped to increase the number of visitors and so on. This is an example of one of the visits of the minister to Çatalhöyük. And over the years there have been many famous people who came to visit as a result of this, these processes. You probably don't know the thing on the bottom right. This is the British TV thing called Blue Peter. You might recognize Prince Charles at the top, and this is a famous BBC presenter, and this is Morgan Freeman. The person that I was most excited to meet was someone called Ian Thorpe, who is a Australian swimmer, and he won many gold medals, and so it was great to meet him. But this is like celebrity Çatalhöyük, and it really has very little to do with any real impact on the local community. These people fly in and out, and they don't really have any engagement at all with the local community. And and that's generally true of the tourism at Çatal as a whole. That people are bussed in and bussed out, or they come in and come out, and they're not allowed to stop at the local shops and so on. They just come and go, and there's no real impact. So this is all superficial media attention, and it has an impact on the global stage, but it really has nothing to do with the local community. And we have actually studied this sort of thing. We've had people who have tried to look at the income gained by local shops and bus companies and taxi companies and so on and so forth. And really there was no impact from this type of engagement. So the publicity does have some positive aspects to it. For example, this is a reconstruction of one of the houses at Çatalhöyük, which I hope will play. So it's nice to do these sorts of things, these virtual reality constructions, and we've had a lot of people who have done these, and they're very engaging, interesting. There was a very good exhibit about Çatalhöyük that used this sort of stuff that Yapı Kredi organised in Istiklal Caddesi some years ago. And so it does allow a broader audience to be reached, allows people to visualize Çatalhöyük in a way that it's very difficult to do when you're actually at the site, because unlike sites like Göbekli, there's not very much there to see at Çatalhöyük. So these sorts of reconstructions are very valuable. And there are lots of fun ways that you can interact with the data with Çatalhöyük using these sorts of technologies. And I don't know if any of you have seen the wonderful art by Refik Anadol, but he took the Çatalhöyük database and constructed these beautiful artistic. This all moves, and it's very three-dimensional and very engaging. But again, this is all sort of elite culture, elite art. It's not really doing anything for the local community. In fact, if anything, it takes resources and focus away from them. So another community that we can talk about where there's been conflict between the interests of the community and the interests of the local community are the Mother Goddess people. And this is a wonderful little statuette or figurine that we found fairly recently at Çatalhöyük. This is looking at it from the front. It's often the case that these images are called Mother Goddesses, but in fact there are no genitalia shown here. So it's possible that this is actually a man, a sort of sumo wrestler type man. But on the whole, these things at Çatalhöyük are seen as women and the Mother Goddess cult. And so we have lots of people who come to Çatalhöyük to search for the Mother Goddess or to feel the presence of the Mother Goddess. These are mainly people from California or from Germany well, actually quite a lot from Istanbul. And they come to pray and worship and to remember the Mother Goddess. And it's led me into sort of strange experiences. I'm probably the only archaeologist to have stood on a fashion show catwalk and introduced a fashion show. But this is a fashion show by Bahar Korçan in Istanbul some years ago, where she developed a line of clothing that was inspired in a loose way by Çatalhöyük, and this led to a lot of global publicity. This is a Japanese, I think, magazine which shows some of the clothes that they were saying were Çatalhöyük-like. So you had all these sort of 6-foot-high models wearing very little, and then they're all supposedly copying this fat lady in the middle from Çatalhöyük. It's very, very strange, but nevertheless, it was a big event. And this was all related to the Mother Goddess idea. So as I said, we have had lots of people coming in this sort of way to visit the site. And some years ago, particularly the groups from California, wanted to somehow contribute to the local community by building a women's centre in the local village. So right by Çatalhöyük, there's a village called Küçükköy, and they built, they took over a house, and they wanted it to be a resource for women in the village. This is very rural, traditional, very conservative, very religious central Anatolia. And they wanted to engage the women in circle dances and playing the guitar and educating them about the role of women in society and so on, and to try in a way liberate the women in some way or other. This was of course very much resented by many people in the village, and their house was mysteriously burned down, and we were never told what the reason, whether that was an accident or whether someone intentionally burned it down. But the feeling was that it was intentionally burned down as part of the reaction against these incoming groups. So you see, what's going on here is that you have these women coming global. It was global women, if you like, feminist women who are coming with some set of agenda that they want to impose on the local community. But in fact, it makes the situation in the community worse in many ways, because the elders and the men in the village try to stop this and to try to manage, as I'll say a bit later, try to manage the way the women were interacting with us. So I want finally then to come to the local community itself and to give you some sense of how they were experiencing all this and how they were responding to these other members, other people, other stakeholders around the heritage table, and what the impact of it all was on them. So we worked with people from the local community in a number of ways, both in excavation and in processing the finds. Here there are a group of women from the local community who are sorting the micro remains into different categories and so on for us. And when I arrived and said that I wanted to employ people, including women, the elders from the village said that I was not allowed to do that because women were not allowed to work, particularly for foreigners. But I insisted that I wanted to have women, and in the end they agreed. But they said that if I employ women, I cannot pay them I can pay the men, but I can't pay the women. So I pay their husbands and so on, rather than the women themselves. And again, I felt that was wrong, and that and so I insisted that we pay the women, and we did end up paying the women. And we can maybe discuss later whether you think that was a good decision or not. But we did try to engage the community in the decisions that we were making about how the site should be developed, about whether we should build a shelter in the north area and the south area and have a visitor centre and so on and so forth. We tried as far as we could to engage the community in these sorts of heritage-type discussions. But it was very difficult. And one way that it was difficult was that the men and the women refused to be in the same discussion. So here you can see our discussion with the women and the children, and that we would have to have separate meetings with the men from the villages. And one of the difficulties was that the men and the women had completely different views about how Çatalhöyük should be developed. So it was very difficult to get any consensus because of these very, very radically different perspectives that the men and the women had, and also the different groups within the men and women, particularly different groups amongst the men became clear. One of the reasons that we found it difficult to engage with the local community was that they themselves had very little knowledge about Çatalhöyük or about archaeology in general. And so one of the things that we did was to have a long-running educational program that involved bringing 20 children every day to spend the day at Çatalhöyük, and to do various activities and to learn about Çatalhöyük, but also to learn about archaeology and why heritage is important. So Gülay Sert, who did this and also published many children's books about this, in the end taught thousands and thousands of children over the years. And this was a very successful program. And one of the things that they did when they came was to excavate the spoil tip that had been left by Melot. And the smiles on these kids' faces when they found some artifact was just really very heartwarming, and very much engaged them in what we were doing. One of the perhaps success stories of this whole community engagement project was that the site guard, who was Sadratin Dural here, one of the site guards, became very interested in what we were doing and asked lots and lots of questions about it. And in the end, he said, could he have a laptop, because he wanted to write his own book about Çatalhöyük. And sometime later, he showed me what he had written, and it was 50,000 words of text, but simply words in a long line. There was no full stop and no capital letter, no comma, no paragraph. It was just 50,000 words, because he was very, very uneducated. He left school at 10. And so we edited it and put full stops and commas in, and it was published in America, and actually was reviewed by some of the major anthropology journals. In fact, had better reviews than any of my books have ever had. It was, and he went on to write other books, which are sold in the local villages and towns. So in a way, this was a success story, but in fact, it isn't really, because he ended up in prison, and then it's a sad personal story that didn't work out very well. We tried to take the whole relationship with the community very seriously and professionally, and one of the things that we did from very early on was to engage ethnographers One of them, the most long-standing and successful one, was Aika Batu. And she helped us very much in terms of our relationship with the community and trying to integrate them into what we were doing, despite the problems that I mentioned. More recently, in the last 10, 15 years of the project, we had a Native American called Sonia Atalay, who developed what is called community-based participatory research. And she is probably the global leader in terms of trying to develop mechanisms for participatory research with communities. And so has written a book called Community-Based Participatory Research. And so it was great to have her as a Native American working with us at Çatalhöyük and helping us develop our community relations. And one of the things she did was realize that using comics was a good way of telling people about the project, and so they produced comics and handed them around free into the community. But we began to run into problems fairly quickly because we wanted these comics and the books that were developed from them to be sold, or rather to be provided free, in fact, in the schools. So Sonia and others developed these into books that were supposed to be provided to the schools in the area. But it became clear that the schools were not going to adopt the books, and when we tried to explore why, it was largely because in the books we talked about evolution and prehistory, and the imams were unhappy with us talking about Çatalhöyük as a prehistoric site in an evolutionary sequence. And so the books were never adopted. And another example of the sort of conflicts that emerged was that during our excavations, we found some burials that were not Neolithic, they were early Islamic. And Sonia Atalay, who is a Native American, comes from the background where reburying remains is of great importance. So in the United States, reburying human remains that are found by archaeologists is the normal procedure. And so Sonia felt that these early Islamic burials that we found should be reburied in the village. And so we engaged with the local community and asked them if they would like the bodies to be reburied. And they really were not very interested. But we sort of forced it on them. We sort of, because we felt it was right, because of our background, particularly Sonia's background, because we felt it was right, we were sort of trying to change the way people felt about the dead. Again, we could talk perhaps later about whether you feel that's right or wrong, but it's a good example of where, with very good intentions, people like Sonia are coming to try to make things better, but in a way they're making it worse by trying to change things. And perhaps the clearest example of this is that we try to develop programs whereby the women from the local community started making kilims again. You know, kilim production was a major part of the activity in this part of the Konya region up until recently. But most people have forgotten how to do it, and it's a dying art. But we brought in the looms, and we trained people to make kilims using some of the more recent Çatalhöyük designs. And the idea was that we would somehow authenticate these designs and sell the kilims at a higher price. And this was a program that was going very well, and we were very excited about it. The young women were very excited. It was going really well. And then the men in the village stopped it because they were unhappy with the way that young women were were working with a foreign project. And in fact, these sorts of problems were emerging all over the place. And the result of them was that all community research at Çatalhöyük was stopped by the Ministry of Culture. So around 2014-15, all of this work was stopped. We were not allowed to go in the village, we were not allowed to talk to people in the community. It was just stopped because it was thought that we were somehow being subversive, or the elders in the village were unhappy with the way there was an impact. So we were finding that many people, women working on the project, were starting new careers and developing their own professional lives through the support that we were giving them. And this was obviously seen as threatening in some way. And so the community engagement was stopped. And so the main point that I want to make about this is that people who are trying to do their best, and with people like Sonia Atalay are very, very sensitive to and very careful about community participation. Their whole lives is about how do we work in a sensitive way with communities. That even these people are acting in such a way that the end result is negative, that the end result is that the community work is stopped. And so this is an enormous sadness to me, because I had always felt that community engagement was the prize of Çatalhöyük. That was what we were really going to be good at. And then to find that we'd failed. So why did we fail? Well, I think we failed because we brought assumptions with us, and we tried to introduce those in a way that, although it was trying to be sensitive, was not. And I want to finish really by saying that the trouble with the heritage table, and the trouble with people around the heritage table trying to negotiate, is that it's very unequal. It's not the case that everybody around the table has equal power. And powerful and differing interests make community engagement in cultural heritage policy very difficult. And I'll give you some examples here of how this really comes back to us, and for us to think, are the terms that I'm using, are the words that I'm using somehow creating problems? So, for example, the word archaeology, we just take for granted the idea that archaeology is a good thing in some way or other. At least I do as an archaeologist. But for many people, archaeology can be something that has a negative impact. So, for example, at Çatalhöyük, the site of Çatalhöyük used to be a place where people collected plants, and where the women gathered together with their children during when they had some time. So it was an escape, if you like, where they collected plants and talked to each other. But the archaeologists, when they started digging, built fences around Çatalhöyük and made it no longer available. So is archaeology always a good thing? Do we take that for granted? Prehistory, there are departments here and around Europe called Department of Prehistory. But of course there is no society that has no history. All societies have history. All you're talking about here is whether societies have writing or not. And why is that important? And so the word prehistory is a very loaded term. We don't think about it, but it's a very negative term in many parts of the world. And in the Konya region, as we've been seeing, in rural Konya area, prehistory is also a bad term because it has this notion that there was this evolutionary prehistory. We've seen how reburial is a difficult idea. The idea of community. I've been saying we have a relationship with the community, but what we've seen is that the community is very divided. There are lots and lots of different competing communities, men and women, older and younger. The different villages have their different positions, and so is there really a community? And if you use that word, are you somehow assuming some pristine a nice community that is living in this rural landscape. The word indigenous is a very, very loaded term. Someone like Sonia Atalay talks about herself as an indigenous person, but and she tries to use this term in Turkey. But what is an indigenous person in Turkey? And many cultures around the world refuse to be seen as indigenous because it somehow has negative connotations. It's associated in English with the word indigent, which means lazy and so on. And maybe we could talk about that later as well, if you like, about whether there are culturally different groups in Turkey, whether they would ever use the word indigenous. And certainly there are particular ideas of gender equality that we're all bringing to the table that are very diverse and different. So my point is that just using these words that we take for granted can be divisive. And I think the onus is on us to think whether use of these and other terms can be changed. Can we not use the word prehistory, but come up with some other word instead of that, for example. So that's it, thank you.